Should doctors give to charity? Keep listening as we dive in. Welcome to the Money Meets Medicine podcast, where we talk all about the personal finance topics you wish you had learned in medical school. I'm your host, Justin Harvey, and here is your co-host who often gets asked how old he is by his patients, Dr. Jimmy Turner.
Yeah, this is honestly, if I'm being honest, I try to be. Before the pandemic, this happened a lot more than after the pandemic. It might be because I'm starting to get like a little bit of gray hair in my beard or lack thereof. My facial hair is unimpressive for anybody that's ever seen it. Yeah, I used to get asked all the time, and honestly still do, by patients. And it's almost always like an elderly lady. I don't know why, but it's almost always elderly women. And they're like, I walk up, and this is typically how it goes. Like, hey, I'm Dr. Turner. I'm the anesthesia doctors. Can be helping take care of you today. And they'll normally say something like, oh, okay, so you're the one that's, just going to put me to sleep. That's pretty easy. And I normally say something along the lines of, yeah, I'm also the one that helps to make sure that you wake up. And at which point they're like, well, you look mighty young. And so my favorite quote so far along those lines is like, hey, you look really young. Does your mother know where you are right now? And so I get this comment not infrequently, that or people think that they know me all the time. Like I've got a very familiar face for whatever reason. And so like I used to spend time like trying to figure out like, hey, like where do you work? Where are you from? Where'd you go to school? Where do you go to church? And just to figure out that I apparently just have an incredibly familiar face. So that's the thing.
That's
but yeah, so speaking of church, we're actually going to talk about, a potentially, I don't know, it's an interesting topic. I'm not going to call it like controversial because I don't think it's necessarily controversial. I just think personal finance is personal. And so we're going to talk about, this topic on the show today. Before we dive into charitable giving and the potential impact on your personal finances, just want to remind you 3 financial tasks I feel like every physician in training and early career doc should have taken care of, which is a student loan plan, own occupation disability insurance, and then financial literacy to form that foundation. We work on all 3 of these things over at moneymeetsmedicine.com. So if you need help with a student loan consult, you need to get own occupation disability insurance or a quote for that, or reviewing the policy that you have, or if you want to get free financial literacy content, head over to moneymeetsmedicine.com, where we are happy to help you. So Justin, you're going to have all sorts of perspectives and stories and maybe information or statistics on this that I just don't have. Like at a high level, I understand, charitable giving and maybe some of the reasons that people should participate in it. So maybe I'll just highlight those, and I want to hear some stories. That's what I want to hear.
Yeah.
But at a high level, why people should give. And for me, I kind of break this down into a few different things, and we'll be interested to hear if you've got, some things to add or different perspective on this. But for me, it's partially studies, academics, right? Or behavioral finance. They've looked into this, and there are very few things that you can do with your money in order to actually increase your happiness. Some things get a lot of airtime, like, hey, spend money on experiences instead of things. But this is also another one of them where charitable giving financially has actually been shown to lead to more self-satisfaction and happiness for the giver, which is maybe why that old saying of, it's better to give than to receive may be true. Obviously, for some people listening, there's going to be religious convictions, whether that's, tithing or whatever religious background you come from may involve beliefs around charitable giving. And then the third one that kind of hangs around for me is that at least for W-2 earners, like, if you're an independent contractor, you own your own business, like you have all sorts of tax opportunities available to you. But if you're a W-2 employee, like there may be some few that I'm forgetting, but like in terms of big hitters, you've got like SALT tax for like 10 grand, you got mortgage interest, and then charitable giving. I mean, those are 3 of the biggest levers that you have in order to reduce your tax burden. And if you have student loans, to reduce your student loan payment, for that pre-tax giving is the 4th one, right? That reduces the student loan payment. These other 3 don't. But charitable giving, right, is one of the 4 in my estimation as a W-2 employee that is available to you. So Justin, if I lay out those 3 reasons people should consider giving to charitable giving, what am I leaving out, or do you think similarly about this?
I think that pretty well covers it. There's probably others. And one thing I would say in terms of framing this conversation, this is one of the things that I like best about my job. is, I like helping people make informed financial decisions for a number of reasons. One of the reasons that it's special for me is that it's a privileged position where I can observe generosity that no one else even knows happens
Sure.
in many cases. And I think the most profound moments that I've had as an advisor, and I also think this is a special area because I have, an intellectual understanding, and my family holds generosity as a high value as well, and we do the best we can with that. But I have had clients who know way more about this stuff and have taught me many things about what it means to truly be generous in the way that they give sometimes more than I'm comfortable with, as the financial advisor who's like, listen, you gotta make sure that when you're 92 years old, you're not living in a cardboard box somewhere. And those moments that I have gotten to observe and advise around, and also even participate in vicariously, but meaningfully to help develop the opinions around like what is the right threshold for a generosity. It's very special. And so I love this part of my job.
It's actually really interesting now that you say that. Like, I'm going to be very candid. There was a time in my life, so I'm a believer, I'm Christian, have been since my junior year in high school. And so there were many, many years in my life where I gave without thinking at all, right? I would just give 10%. It's what I'm called to do. And I would do it every single month. And interestingly, and maybe this is biblical, just in, it is easier for, a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich person to get to heaven. Right. But as I've actually progressed and thought more intentionally about my money, because I knew nothing about money back then, and I just gave because, that is one of the few things that I did know that I wanted to do with my money was charitable giving. I would give off the top without even thinking about it. And then as I became financially literate, giving charitably, even though that's my nature, just it's one of the things that I love doing, has actually become more difficult. And I don't know if that's because of my increase in financial literacy and understanding the impact of that giving on my own family's personal finances, or if it is, that biblical, like, we've become wealthier and potentially more attached to our money. I'm not exactly sure where that comes from, but that is something that internally I struggle with, if I'm being honest. And so I think that I don't know if that's a correlation with wealth or if that's just a correlation with financial literacy. But, when I hear you talking about people giving just levels, that are beyond potentially quote unquote wise, that reminds me of like my days back then, and which are very different than my days now.
I very much relate to that arc. And, my wife and I are Christians as well. And we espouse this idea of tithing sort of from what the Bible says is the first fruits, like first money you get, like 10% goes to the church or to charitable organizations aligned there. And that's a value we hold highly and have at the same time. Yeah, I feel that tension. And interestingly, yeah, I mean, I'm also in a position where I observe the values of my clients, and I try to not project, and this is true in any area, but particularly in generosity and in charitable giving, I don't want to hold them to my values in this area. I want to understand what their values are and help them fulfill those. But interestingly, so I would say I give out of religious conviction. I would also make the observation that as somebody who believes that we are created, I think that it's my opinion that God kind of hardwired into the universe this observable benefit that comes from when you give away stuff. You become less attached to it and you just are less stressed about your things. And so while I don't want to project a religious argument on people, I would say because there is an observable benefit to giving something and it makes you feel good. And when you have more than enough, it at some level just seems reasonable to give something to people that you care about or causes that you care about. If you did it for no other reason, then you're going to be happier. And we sort of fundamentally make this argument about everything, like if you spent all the money that you had in whatever way just to maximize your happiness, you can make a pretty compelling argument that some meaningful percentage of it should probably be spent in what we would call a generous sort of vein. Whether it's actually tax deductible or not is kind of a different question. Well, doesn't really matter.
I actually, that's one of the reasons why I don't view this as a potentially controversial topic. I kind of mentioned at the top of the show that some people do. The reason I don't is because academic, let's just say humanistic studies have shown it's beneficial for you, right? There's religious arguments for it from multiple different religions. And so, regardless of whether you're religious or not, there's benefit, right? And so, to your point, which is why I don't view charitable giving as being a controversial financial topic, although I know that there are going to be some that disagree. But given the benefit in terms of happiness, behavioral finance studies, or religious reasons, one of the questions I get asked all the time, Justin, I'm kind of curious about your perspective from a planner's point of view, is, and my views on this have shifted personally, is like this pre-tax versus post-tax is the way that I view it. We talked before the show, and you framed it as kind of gross versus net, in terms of, do you tithe based on that base salary all the way at the top, or do you tithe after the 401k has been taken out and the HSA has been taken out and your taxes have been taken out? And for me, for a long time, I used to kind of view this as like a first fruits argument, that you just tithe off the gross, and you make $300,000, it's 25 grand a month, and so you give $2,500 to charitable giving. And as I've transitioned, I've actually started to view this as, more of a post-tax opportunity. And the reason why is because I plan to continue to give charitably, my family does, when we get to retirement. And so, that money that I'm quote unquote stuffing away pre-tax is going to end up being tithed anyway later at growth with gains, as opposed to just tithing off the gross and then trying to do the complicated math, figuring out like which part of this hasn't been tithed yet, and then tithing off the gains. It just seemed more complicated to me.
Yeah. I can tell you the way I think about this for myself. I consider myself like super blessed, lucky, privileged, all of those things, to be doing what I'm doing. I'm married to an anesthesiologist. I'm a financial advisor. We are just statistically among the richest people who will have ever lived on the face of the earth. And so what does that mean in terms of my use of my economic resources? And all of my clients basically fall in the same category. If you're a doctor today in America, you're among the richest people that have ever lived, just statistically speaking. And so, yeah, you could, I tend to use this more loosely and try to round up, like way up. So 10% is kind of the minimum, but I'm going to try to, for people who espouse to sort of the religious minimum threshold. And I have actually clients of a number of different faith traditions who give in a sort of regimented way, in an intentional way, and they target certain percentages. And many of them do kind of round up because they're like, I make enough money that I'm willing to have trade-offs in my lifestyle, modest trade-offs in my view, in their view. This is me talking as them. I'm willing to have modest trade-offs in my lifestyle, in my view, in order to target that 12, 15, 20% of, in some cases, gross income. So they're giving away, in some cases, 6 figures a year. And frankly, they seem like they're great. They're happy. They have what they need, and they're living a life that is aligned with their values, which I think is sort of the key here. So when I think about this for myself, the conclusion I've come to is I like to give from the gross. So if I make $500,000, 10%, 50,000 per year. But that's the starting point. And I think like in retirement, if you take a doctor who's making $300,000 to $750,000 a year, and you're saving between 10 and 22% per year for 3 decades, you're going to be a doctor in your 60s who has $7 million or 10, or what, depending on how your investments do. And like, what is sure, you could buy a $5 million house with that, and maybe that's the right decision. Or you're probably going to, if you're charitably disposed already, you're probably just going to continue to be generous with what you have, hopefully, and not overly, trying to figure out what the bare minimum is and kind of scraping by on that. So that's my view, is like I try to just round up. I do 10% of gross, and like I'll figure out that future problem when I get there, but I assume that I'm going to have way more money than I need, and I'm going to be able to write big checks, hopefully, if I plan well. And my wife wants to do this too, which thankfully I'm married to a woman who we're pretty aligned on what generosity looks like, which I am super grateful for. This is one of those things they don't always tell you before you get married. Very, 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 very important in terms of financial decision making and what generosity looks like. And you can imagine, like, somebody wants to give away a double-digit percentage of your income, and the other person thinks that's absolutely insane. There's some real fence mending that needs to happen there.
And I think that speaks to the personal finances, personal sort of discussion, because You know, I'm an anesthesiologist and I feel this way. So like, I certainly know there are primary care physicians, you know, or maybe part-time physicians that are listening that have a very different economic situation than I do, than you do. You know, who are trying to, you know, save a 529 for their kids, who are trying to make sure that they, you know, can play baseball and soccer, and you know, who are working and being taxed at high levels, potentially in a high cost of living state. And the idea of taking it off the top at the gross level may be, you know, less than palatable for them. And so, you know, it's an interesting thing, because, you know, I think that, as with anything, at least in my view, it comes down to being intentional. I have always kind of viewed this as like a matter of the heart. And I will say that one of the barometers that I've had, you know, coming from a similar, you know, faith tradition that you come from, is I've always tried to, let's just say, give until it hurts. You know, and at some level, there's some level of sacrifice that I'm making where it is uncomfortable, the amount that I give. And so for me, that's always been a bit of a barometer for how we're doing in terms of our charitable giving. I do hope to give, you know, larger and larger and larger amounts as we progress in life. And so that's a goal of ours too, that we share.
There's a quote that I really like that I find really helpful, and I think it maps on nicely to both sort of religious-based giving and non. And it's a C.S. Lewis quote, which says, and I think this is an accurate reflection of my understanding too, because the Bible doesn't say give 10%. It says a lot of things about Old Testament versus New Testament, and there is a tithe language that's used, but it's not one of the 10 commandments is give 10%. But what C.S. Lewis says is something to the effect of, I can't tell exactly how much is the right amount to give, but there should be things in my life that I want to do and I can't, because my charitable giving precludes it. So that maps on perfectly with what you just described, that like there's some sacrifice. Like, I'm not living as large as I possibly could be. There's some trimming on the high end that there's a trade-off, and it's redirecting those resources in the direction of generosity that I hold that as a value, and many non-religious people.
Yeah. And I think that tracks perfectly with where we are. And so, Justin, people are listening to this, are like, okay, great. There's tax benefit. You know, academic studies have shown happiness, long-term self-satisfaction benefits. There are religious reasons to give, if that fits the person's, you know, beliefs and perspective. So the question naturally is, okay, like let's talk, you know, nuts and bolts here. Well, how do people give? And naturally, one of the most, you know, obvious ways is like, you just give, right? And we should probably mention that, you know, you can give financially, you can give with your time, you can give with your resources, you can give with your talents. So there are multiple ways to give, but specifically when it comes to financial giving, you could simply just write the check each month, right? Simplest way to do it. By the way, you need to track that. My accountant was just asking for our information, you know, over the last few months, and sent it in. And I was like driving to work one day, and I was like, oh man, like there's that one check that I wrote to like my kids' elementary school, and I'd asked for the information in November and never got it. And so I had to email them again, basically be like, hey, you know, do you still have that? Do you have the tax ID and the information that I need in order to send this to my accountant? And so keeping track of all your charitable giving, I think is an important piece, particularly if you're going to be giving one-off checks, or, you know, ways that aren't automatically sent to you. But Justin, do you have any experience with donor advised funds? Because this gets some airtime in the physician finance space, and I obviously know about it from like an academic high level point of view, but not from like, I haven't ever done a DAF or a donor advised fund myself personally. So, you know, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I do. And actually, before I dive into those mechanics, when I'm talking about generosity with people, I do like to frame it more broadly and say, if you have no idea, and I actually have a couple clients like this, they're like, I feel like I want to start giving, I'm not sure what I should do. What I suggest to them is like, take one afternoon per month and find an organization whose mission you believe in, and like just knock on their door and say, I'm here, and I brought my work gloves, and I'm here to do whatever it is that you do, and get a flavor for what's happening here. And first of all, again, in a strictly humanist sort of worldview, you're going to feel great because you're helping people that are less fortunate or whatever cause, and you're making the world a better place. And then you're going to find that you're like, invested. You're motivated. You're like, okay, I see what's happening. And I see if I wrote that $10,000 check, they could do that one thing that's like the project that's tacked up on the wall for, the fourth quarter of 2026, but we can do that like tomorrow if I just stroke the check. So I find that getting involved with your time, or serving on a board, maybe you can't give an afternoon, but you can do like an 8 to 9:30 p.m. Zoom meeting every 3 months. And the perspective that you have in organizational leadership, for example, can really, if you run your department's budget and you've got a little rinky-dink nonprofit who doesn't know how to, do bookkeeping, you can really, through the contribution of your expertise, help things start moving in the right direction. And then similarly, be motivated financially to follow that. In terms of the donor advised fund, I love donor advised funds. They work best when married with like a separately managed account strategy, also known as an SMA, also known as direct indexing, sort of in some cases, which basically means you buy a bunch of different securities. As an example, like a S&P 500 style US large cap stock universe, you're paying a manager to buy every single company in the US large cap space. This is large US based companies of 10 billion in market cap or more. So you've got 650 of those, or however many there are. You let that run for a year, and then after a year, you get into long-term capital gains territory. And some of them, like if you look at, like Nvidia. So my clients who started doing this in the last few years, Nvidia is the one just like 10 bagger. It's been up and up and up and up and up. And so if they bought Nvidia as one of their winners, what happens with this account is, in aggregate, it performs kind of like the S&P, but you can turbocharge its benefit whenever you're working in a space where you want to give charitably, because you can take the handful of the biggest winners that are up like 5,000%, and those taxable gains, which would be taxed to you at your long-term cap gains rate applicable based on your income, you can actually give them, move them to a donor advised fund, and you move out the lion's share of those gains for this particular position, where it's then you get credit for the full amount. So if you buy it at 1,000, and after a year it grows to 10,000, you give away that stock to the donor advised fund, you get credit for a $10,000 charitable gift in the year of giving it. Then you sell it, you turn it into cash, and then you can cut checks from the donor advised fund. It's basically just like another brokerage account, which has a checkbook attached to it. And then you send $2,000 here, $2,000 there, or you send the whole 10,000 to wherever you want to. The nice thing about a donor advised fund is it gives you this flexibility. You can decouple the migration of the stock to the account and realizing the gift from the actual disbursement of the cash to a nonprofit. So if you got a bunch of winners and you want to move them in and move 100 grand and then slowly give that over 5 years, you can do that.
So we should probably do a show at some point on direct indexing versus, just low cost diversified, very boring indexing without a direct idea. But educate me here on this. So what's the advantage of direct indexing for a donor advised fund as opposed to just putting it in, a broadly diversified index fund?
Yeah, good question. So it could still work if you buy the S&P, if you IVV is the iShares ETF for the S&P 500. The problem in air quotes with IVV is if you held it in 2023, it was up 22%. Awesome, great, we like that. If you held all the different component parts, you can isolate the components that were up 130% and move more of the gains out. So on a dollar for dollar basis, if you start with $100,000 and it grows to $122,000 over a year, if you want to give $20,000 to charity, you can give $20,000 of the ETF. But if you're doing that, you're only giving away $4,000 worth of gains based on that 20% growth. But if you're doing a direct indexing strategy and a handful of the stocks are just way, way up, like in the last couple of years, the mega cap tech stocks have just been high flyers. If instead you give away your Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and Nvidia shares, you might be able to give away $20,000 and give away $15,000 of gains rather than just $4,000 that the ETF would permit. So it's just a way to move more gains because of the granular tax access that you get.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So whereas for a long-term retirement strategy, because you're not going to be individually selling those things annually, it may not be as advantageous, but in a donor advised fund, it is something that has kind of a unique benefit there. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think there is some long-term benefit. There's pros and cons to separately managed accounts. There's also ongoing tax loss harvesting, so you kind of get it on the downside as well. Like the stuff that's down, if you hold the ETF, the IVV security, you're not able to isolate the losers. They're sort of in the aggregate bucket that went up 22%. But if you've got the direct index strategy, at the end of every year, you give away the winners, you sell the losers, reinvest those proceeds in similar securities to maintain consistent market exposure. And it's a more tax efficient way of, I tell my clients, like, you're giving like the wealthy. Wealthy people give away appreciated securities. They don't cut checks. They remove taxable gains from their estate. And you can do it with mutual funds and ETFs, yes, but you can also do it with individual
Yeah, no, that's
stocks.
really cool. And to be frank, something I didn't know about. So I think that's a great example and a way that's, worth considering in terms of giving. And yeah, that's actually really neat. So speaking of just stroking checks, another way that, I've thought about being, let's just say, creative or thoughtful about your giving, because I don't think, like, from a philosophical level, I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to give in a way that is both beneficial for the person that you're giving to and also to benefit yourself. I think, being shrewd with your money is a good thing. So donor advised funds, the way you just described, right? You're able to give more while actually giving the same. And so another way that I've actually found really interesting, and I've mentioned this briefly on the show maybe a year or two ago, is on alternating your years of giving. And so, maybe a math example here, just to, get into the weeds a little bit, may be helpful. And I actually wrote this down so that I wouldn't screw it up live on the air, because that's just super embarrassing, right? And so let's say that you're planning on giving, over a 4-year period, right? And let's say that, in this situation, you got a married couple, they're renting, or maybe they paid off their house. They're giving $15,000 annually, and they've let's just say they've got a $10,000 SALT tax for state and local tax that they pay, and so they could give $15,000 per year and give $60,000 overall over that 4-year period, or they could give $30,000 in year 1 and in year 3, and then take the standard deduction in years 2 and 4. Now, the standard deduction is right under $30,000 now. And so if you do the math on that, right, they give $30,000 in year 1 plus their $10,000 in tax. So that's $40,000 in tax deductions. The next year they take the standard, that's $30,000. The following year, same thing. They, give the $30,000 plus a $10,000 SALT, that's $40,000, and they take the standard. The next year is $30,000. If they just given the $15,000 and taken the SALT tax in addition to that, each year they basically would end up with $20,000 less in tax deductions by giving their $15,000 per year. And so, this is really interesting, right? Because they are giving the same amount over a 4-year period, which is, potentially a goal for them. If, you're listening to this deep into the show, charitable giving is a goal for you. And then they're saving $20,000 in tax deductions, giving the same amount of money just by alternating the years in which they double up. And so I've always thought that was a really cool thing. My family, like, we can't personally employ this. Like, I mean, we could, but it's not quite as helpful for us because we still have mortgage interest plus the SALT tax plus our charitable giving basically makes us itemize automatically anyway every year. So I don't know there would be as big of a benefit for my family. But Justin, I'm sure, but you've heard of this technique and probably employed it for some of your clients. Is this something worth pursuing, or is it just a lot of work for no benefit?
It's definitely worth being aware of. And the people for whom it makes the most sense are the ones who are not going to, at baseline, fill up that standard deduction with the other deductions that they have. So this is a perfect example. You're renting and you're married. You got your SALT, which is that $10,000, but if the ceiling is $28,000, which I think it is in 2023, your first $18,000 of charitable giving, you're essentially getting no tax benefit for. So we would call this gift batching. And this is a perfect example of, over 4 years, you're going to reduce your taxable income by $20,000. You multiply that by the effective tax rate of 35%. You're talking about a $7,000 in your pocket over these 4 years. And actually, it's over 3 years, because if you're doing years 1 and 3, it's $7,000 over 3 years. You take the growth on that over a few decades, and that's like, it's real money. So I think this gifting strategy, batching your gifting, in particular, if you don't have that mortgage interest, is worth looking at to make sure that you are, getting the most deductions that you can.
Yeah,
It's a smart way to do it.
just a couple of different ways to think about it. You can stroke the check, write it every month. You can consider a donor advised fund, which I thought was really cool. Just in the way that you described the direct indexing and the benefit of that, plus tax loss harvesting. That's kind of the double added benefit, and potentially, depending on your situation, the alternative years of giving. But yeah, anything else to add before we close this one out, Justin?
I think in closing, just with one more little anecdote, and when I'm thinking about people that have taught me about this, I'm thinking about a couple moments in particular, but there's this one person who is further along in years and not married, and I realized that although I know all the techniques about, the optimization with the SMA and the DAF and the gift batching and all that, seeing firsthand up close somebody who does not guaranteed have enough reach into their pocket, and in this case it was the forgiveness of a debt that a friend, they loaned some money and they saw the burden that was putting on their younger friend, and they said, you know what, I'm just going to write off this 40 grand, which was, this is probably somebody with a net worth less than $1 million in this particular case. And so I'm thinking, I'm not sure you can afford that.
Money.
This is real. This is a good example of there's things that this person's going to want to do that later on they may not be able to do because of this act of generosity. And by the way, it's non-tax deductible. That was part of what I think really moved me in this moment, was this is a person that doesn't care about the efficiency or the optimization. This is like a relational expression of love, essentially, to this friend. And nobody knows about it except me and her and the person whose debt was forgiven. So I'm perpetually grateful to have clients like that in my life from whom I can learn a lot about, maybe not the donor advised fund utilization, but about what it means to be willing to share with those who need it.
I think that's a great story to end on. So hopefully this show has been helpful for you, giving you some creative ways to think about charitable giving. Make sure to share it with other medical professionals, friends of yours that you feel like may benefit from listening to this show. And before we head out, don't forget, if you need help with your student loans, own occupation disability insurance, or a financial literacy foundation, you can get all three of those things at moneymeetsmedicine.com, including the ability to snag the Physician Philosopher's Guide to Personal Finance, a book that I wrote about the 20% of personal finance you need to get 80% of the results. All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Justin and I will see you next week. Cheers. Justin Harvey is a certified financial planner at APM Wealth, where he helps anesthesiologists and pain medicine physicians. Dr. Jimmy Turner is a practicing academic anesthesiologist at Wake Forest in North Carolina. He's also a licensed insurance agent. However, neither Justin or Jimmy are your financial planner, investment advisor, or insurance agent. This show is expressly for general education and entertainment purposes only. Nothing should be considered financial advice. All views expressed are solely the views of the guests on the show and do not represent the views or opinions of their employer.